In this special edition of both the Space Dojo Show and Creator Podcast, we're going to talk about where in the world is Meteor heading. Stay tuned. This episode is for Friday, December 9th, 2016. Welcome, Creator fans. I'm your host, Josh Owens, and Today we have a special edition, and I have two guest hosts with me. Dean Radcliffe, welcome, Dean.
Hey, good to be back, Josh.
And Chris Pena.
Yeah, how's it going, y'all?
Yeah. So I don't know. Chris reached out to me. So you have a YouTube channel, right, Chris?
Yeah, it's called Dev Coffee.
Dev Coffee, yeah. So I'll probably, if you're listening to this, we'll put the link in the show notes, but if you're watching this, then down below, there's going to be a link to that. But you reached out to me and just said, hey, I want to come on the podcast and do something. And I wanted to do something today. And Dean actually, I just hit him up at the last minute and said, hey, I want to be on it too. Because I told him we we're going to talk about the direction that Meteor is heading and how things are going. And he had just listened to the episode where we talked about Aeronoda's goodbye post. And then I said some things, and then he wrote a blog post in response to that. And I wish Abby were around, but
Abby
he's busy today because he also wrote a relevant post. So rather than just talking about specific news posts, I thought we'd talk about where things are headed with Meteor. And I don't know, I've had a lot of thoughts brewing in my head recently with everything that's being said, and things that are being said in the forums. I'm increasingly, I guess, turned off to Meteor, and I think clients are as well, from what I can tell. I've had my last couple clients asking what should they be looking at, what's the right solution for them, and we even have I've been working for Foot Cardigan, and we have a site ready to launch. Mm-hmm. And we had the same conversation a week ago. Should we scrap the whole thing and just start over? And my thoughts are the business benefits. It doesn't make sense to scrap it and start over. I think I'm of the mindset that it makes more sense to launch it and then slowly migrate it over, and try to slowly move it over piece by piece. But you still get that business benefit of having something that gives you more control over the internal processes that they need to have control over, for charging people and shipping stuff and that kind of thing.
Yeah. So back up a bit, Josh. Are you talking about incrementally migrating out of Meteor kind of service by service?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's probably along the lines of the article that Abhi just posted, which is to say change out the pieces that you can where you can, and then hopefully start to minimize the amount that you have to do all at once, in that way, if you can, I don't know, I guess there's no good analogy for it. I was going to say ripping off a Band-Aid, but you really want to set it up so that the Band-Aid's soaked or something first, right? I don't know. That's a terrible analogy.
But see, with Meteor, it's very hard to do that. So if you want to take it piece by piece and, kind of replace it as you want, Meteor's the one, come all package. So it's hard to, be that's why I think Meteor is excellent for prototyping, for the sheer fact that I had to do a site last year for a real estate company. And basically, I had to show these properties, have a login, it's kind of a simple thing, but I was able to do that in a weekend. Whereas if I were to do that in C#, I feel like that would have taken me maybe 3 weeks, just for the sheer fact that I'm able to get, something that I love about Meteor is their account system, man. You're able to just have login and authentication done without even thinking about it. And that's probably my favorite feature of Meteor overall.
I would agree with you. It's a cool feature, but at the same time, it comes with its own share of problems. I don't do Blaze anymore. I feel there's maybe there's a team working on it, and that's great, but it's never really been that speedy for me. And moving Crater, when Sasha redid Telescope to go from Blaze to React, that was a significant speed difference on the front end. And then it made it significantly easier to do SSR as well, which then is a perceived speed difference for the consumer. And I just think, like, I don't know, where was I going to go with this? Like, it's just, I don't think, oh, the account system. And so React, like, if I want to include accounts Facebook, then all of a sudden I'm getting Blaze bundled into my front end. Like, that's actually pretty terrible for a React developer. Like, we're already at this point where we're trying to minimize the amount of JavaScript you have to download before the client side becomes functional. And, here we are, we're going to tack in like an extra half a meg or whatever.
Yeah. Well, I want to back up a bit and consider, like, if Meteor is something that you have a current investment in, there's definitely some question about, is Meteor going to be a platform that people are choosing for new development? And if not, what are the alternatives? I'm interested into that question. I think I've heard a few frameworks thrown around, and I'd like to kind of discuss what people might be starting real-time projects in to get the kind of experience that Chris just said he had, where you can spend a weekend getting a real-time website. I want to know what other tools can deliver that. Well, and then I also have questions about if you have an existing investment in Meteor, how to kind of make choices, like you said, you make a React choice instead of a Blaze choice, so that at least that part of your code base is not dependent on the further existence of Meteor.
Well, my question would be to Chris, like, when you worked on that app, what did you need real time?
I didn't necessarily need real time, no. So that wasn't something that I needed with the app.
Yeah. And I feel like that was a unique selling point.
Yeah. I just gave a talk on Tuesday at the local Ruby meetup, where I'm selling real time 100%, because I think that is the viable platform to start exploring. As a developer who wants to keep my skills advancing and current, there's actually a lot of interesting things that, once you take on the notion of having an indefinite subscription, an observable of results, like, once you take that on, letting go of that, I think, starts leading to the kind of bad web user experiences that have proliferated for the last couple of decades.
I don't know. I mean, I see, like, there are use cases where it makes sense for real time, and I think there's a number of places where it doesn't make sense for real time. And I feel like you're paying a heavy hosting penalty cost choosing Meteor and trying to build something in the long run that works with the systems that they have available. So
yeah, I mean, I spent a lot of time recently convincing businesses and myself and people around me that, like, in general, applications don't want a point in time snapshot of data. Inventory goes to zero. You want customers to be notified about it. You've deployed new code, push that code up from the server into people's browsers. I don't see any other framework that has sophisticated.
Yeah, how many customers are actually guilt group, right? Like, how many care about, like, telling you at the point you hit zero that you hit zero? Like, as long as I'm protecting you from buying the product when I have none to sell, like, isn't that good enough?
I don't know. I guess that is a call, right? Like, customers still have a lot of calls to make. I can't make calls for the customers and for every consultant, but I can definitely say that when I looked at the history of computing, where you assumed, like, before the web, where you were doing sockets programming, bidirectional communication, and agency on both sides. In other words, the client is capable of initiating things and the server is capable of initiating things. To code with servers that are not capable of initiating things back to the user is a historical anomaly. And I think that we're forced into it to serve up documents at URLs, but a REST endpoint to a particular record is not a document. It is a stream of updates to that document. And to not have some kind of protocol support for getting updates on that document, I think is kind of inexcusable at this point. I know I also say that like I had to work in a non-Meteor web framework, just regular Express, doing direct database queries and, you know, basically implementing REST endpoints in that. And it's not that it was like a terrible experience or that I couldn't do it, but it really felt like, you know, I wasn't able to deliver a rich experience that the server can enhance the user's experience in the context of the server. So yeah, I'm not looking for solutions that roll back my real time, and my customers aren't either.
I guess I'm more of a fan of like a solution that offers you the ability to add on real time when it matters. Like that's more interesting to me, right? And that's why I think in the long term, Relay or Apollo, like adding real time update subscription support, like that's interesting. Or looking at Phoenix and channels and like, you know, if things get more interesting in that space, like I think those are very, very interesting things to me for the situations where I would probably care about real time.
Yeah.
You know, that kind of
So a product that I've used, it's an alternative. It's not necessarily a full alternative to Meteor, but it adds that real-time functionality, is Pusher. I don't know if you guys have ever used it, but with C#, you know, it has like a Ruby. They have React Native support. It's something that you can just see a function that, like, I agree with Josh on the sheer fact that there's certain things that you want to be real time. There's certain things that might not be beneficial for real time. You know, if you're sacrificing performance just because you want everything to be real time, you're not really utilizing, you know, everything that you need to be doing there. So with Pusher, you can see full analytics of everything that is real time with your application. I'm a huge fan of it. I have a friend that works there, and he's a huge advocate of it as well. That's why I decided to work over there. So
is it like a pub sub system where you might use a Redis, you could use a Pusher?
Yes, exactly.
It's like a paid service, and you push your notifications to them, and then there's a client library you install, and it'll.
Yeah, you subscribe to channels.
Yeah.
Subscribes to different channels.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm curious, you know, like there might be some applications for that.
Yeah, and again, like that's going to come down to cost, I think, right? But then, like, you've got to compare the cost of that to the cost of like hosting, and what does it cost to host all these people on a real-time Meteor server?
And what is the level of support that you get if you have like a DevOps team or whoever is ultimately going to be operating it? They sometimes have their opinions about how things are hosted and where things are hosted. And when you tell them that they're going to be hosting a Meteor app and maybe they haven't even ever hosted a Node app before, there's a learning curve there. It hasn't been too steep, but there's been some snags in that department for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's definitely like there's a lot of moving parts. Like, so the thing I'll say is I think Meteor's good at a couple of things, right? And one of them is real time. One of them is just getting, I think what Chris was getting at was like an easy dev environment that just kind of operates. And there's even like a known deployment solution at the end, and you can point your customer to that and put it on Heroku and have them pay for it. And like, that's an easy story. Or similarly with Galaxy, if that's, you know, what matters to you. And I think that, you know, that's another piece of it, right? So you've got ease of hosting, perhaps, or known hosting. You've got easy setup for development. You've got real-time support. Like, those are great things. And I think that they're maybe going to be hard to find or understand elsewhere, right? Like if you go look at Feathers or something like that, like the story changes slightly and maybe it's not as easy, right? Because Feathers supports a whole host of backends. Therefore, the scaling story is going to be a little bit different than it is for Meteor. But at the same time, I think a lot of people are just straight up turned off to Meteor because you only have Mongo.
Yeah. Has anyone heard, followed the guy in the forum is Diakonu Theodore, who made something called Meteor Redis Oplog.
Oh, this
No,
is
I haven't.
yeah.
Let's see the post here, though.
Okay, yeah. It's a supposed like a drop-in for Meteor that kind of cuts off the oplog tailing as the source of reactivity, and it installs a Redis. Well, it assumes that there's a Redis that can be used to create channels, like Phoenix channels, to create topics like you would, I think, in Pusher, whatever the terminology is.
Mhm.
So there is this interesting. It's only about 24 days old, but it's gotten a lot of activity on the forum. I'm very intrigued. If performance tests, once we get our performance testing set up, I certainly want to try. I'm attracted to this because it is a drop-in kind of speed up, and I think I wonder whether it helps people get a little more comfortable saying like, oh, so reactivity doesn't have to come from Mongo. I know Feathers defines these notions of services, and like they automatically emit notifications when they're changed, and I think that maps a little bit more onto this Redis oplog implementation. So I think people are playing around with where your reactivity comes from, and that it certainly might not be Mongo oplog tailing for the foreseeable, for long. I don't know.
So last time, I haven't been following the community as closely as I was earlier this year. I know the initial plan was to basically take Apollo and replace the Meteor backend. That way, everyone can have their support for any database that they want. Is that still the plan? Where are they kind of at with that?
So what I'll say, because I actually brought this up in the forums the other day with Sashko, I don't understand why there hasn't been more communication around this, right? Like I feel like this is a failure on their part, because they announced like 1.5 is going to be Apollo integration, and he came back and said like developer like restart speed was more important, so they've been focusing on 1.4.2. And for those that maybe don't know, like if you listen to this show, you probably know, but if you don't know, like there's basically one guy working on Meteor at MDG.
Yeah.
And that's significantly slowed down speed. And so if you read between the lines, right, like they're saying like him working on speeding up restart times has kind of shifted the focus away. And I'm a little surprised to hear that answer, because I feel like if they care about Apollo in the long term and they feel like they could shift Meteor developers into it, because it's clearly their long-term play at this point, I would think that they would offer more in the way of documentation. And like they're saying, like the response from Sashko is like, oh, well, people are already doing this, but no one's documented it. No one's put it out there. Like, here's how we're doing it. Here's the things we run into. Here's how, like, apparently there's a repo. I haven't even looked at it to get to work with the login database setup with Apollo, with the Meteor kind of schema. And so I feel like that's really kind of where they might be falling down. So I don't know what all to make of that post from Sashko, but to me, like, it wasn't enough, right? Because you're telling me, well, we took time to release 1.4.2, but 1.4.2 is out. Like, we appreciate that, and that's great, but like, what's next? What's 1.5 look like? Is that a thing? Are we saying that's not a thing? Like, there's a lot being
a little more communication about the migration path for existing customers.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have been spending a lot of time trying to kind of hedge my bets, so to speak, trying to ensure that that the largest possible fraction of our development efforts are going into code that is basically reusable across potential disruptive technologies. I'm not trying to say that I can see the future or future-proof it, but there's a few technologies that aren't hard-coded to a product. So like, I've been looking a lot at Redux, because it kind of encourages your business logic that steps you from one state to the next of your system I've been picturing like systems as these like state machines, and actions come in, and then they either move to a new state because the action was valid, or they throw an exception. And I've been investing my learning resources in like actions, Redux, React, very purely functional things. But I've definitely got my eyes and ears peeled for anything that I can find out about Apollo. I was in the Slack channel. I've read every Medium post. I've responded to a few. But I don't feel like I could speak very intelligently at my company yet about Apollo. But I can speak to some of these technologies that have been very easy for me to pick up and seem like a very sound investment in in learning that is not vendor lock-in.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Like I was half listening. I was actually like looking at this post. So it has been updated since I said something 3 days ago. There was further discussion from Sashko and Thea about they're going to maybe write a blog post and have some examples of how to use Meteor and Apollo together. So that's certainly good to hear. But
Yeah.
I think it definitely like leaves us in this weird state. And I agree. Like we definitely want to avoid the vendor lock-in. I think, to me, the biggest piece we're missing here, and the piece that was supposed to be 1.5, and we talked about this a little bit before the show with Chris, like I really think that having full NPM support would help tremendously here. And what I mean by that is actually moving the libraries themselves to NPM, and therefore, to NPM. And then I can do like yarn or NPM install Meteor and get everything that I need. And, we've become a real, like no strings, right? Like no longer Pinocchio, like no custom package system. Like we've officially joined the Node community. And I think that could potentially do good things for the community in the long run. But again, like a lot of that was placed on hold, and now we're hearing weird things like, 1.4.2 was needed, so we took time for that, and like there's really no need for any Apollo integration. It sounds like they really just want to do a couple blog posts and it'll be good. I don't know. Like it just feels weird because they took a lot of money, and I feel like they aren't talking about it a whole lot.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know what the best resources are. Hopefully people will respond to the show with some of those things. And if anyone wants to respond to me to this point, I'm curious if there's going to be, with 1.5, is everything going to be through Apollo, or is it going to be Apollo plus the existing stack? I'll refrain from, expressing my preference for which one it is. I just kind of want to know what they're going to say. Again, I kind of feel like the existing DDP stuff is pretty good for shuttling the messages around that I think my educational classroom-based collaborative application requires. I think DDP can get the messages around, and that's kind of what I've been focusing on. But I'd love to see more guidance on what the future being a Meteor developer looks like with Apollo.
Yeah.
And something I kind of want to go back to, we were talking about packages and everything. So when I left off with Meteor, this is more than likely last year, I don't know if you guys have heard of Mantra.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
So that's something that I was like following pretty closely, because I thought it was super interesting to be able to have these kind of set of rules, like this is the way that you do things, and have more structure. Because I remember back in the day when you used to start a vanilla Meteor app, it would have no structure to it, and there's all these different people doing different structures. And Mantra kind of set one way, so it started getting kind of I went and looked back at the Mantra GitHub repo and see that there's like no activity at all.
Yes.
So that's that. Whenever projects like that, they take up a lot, they get a lot of leeway towards the beginning, and then they start to slow down. It's a little bit disheartening, want to come back to the community when you see stuff like that happen. I know it happens all the time, but
Well,
you know,
I
the
mean,
whole
that's
switch from, you know, npm or from atmosphere to npm, well, you know, atmosphere is still there. You saw all these packages that you would use that started slowly dying because of npm support. There were alternatives and stuff. So
yeah, yeah. So okay, like, and maybe this has led to my philosophy of preferring maybe libraries over frameworks. I like looking at how well React has done, right, or Angular, or I don't know, like any number of them, right? Like you can argue they're all doing really great. I think to me the problem here is like we still have this ivory tower approach of, you know, I said something about the problem with accounts Facebook back in July, I want to say. Like I can look up the ticket and see when it was. And actually spent a lot of time doing investigation work to pinpoint where the problems existed. And that led to a conversation that happened over the next couple months. Like we only got, I want to say sometime before Thanksgiving, we finally got the approval to merge the fix for accounts Facebook. I mean, this wasn't a huge effort. And the problem is like it had to be approved by Tom Coleman. You know, there was discussion with Zoltan, and I think Sashka was in there. Like it just turned into a huge thing to make a simple change to get Blaze out of my React. And like I think that just speaks to like, even though they're asking for core contributors and everyone's like, yeah, we totally want to help, like it's just not, it's still not easy, because like you're usually faced with, we need to have some internal conversations, or you know, like you just can't participate in the process very well. And I think that's it's really interesting to watch the dichotomy between the two projects of Meteor and Apollo, because I think Apollo has taken the opposite approach. Like, let's be open. Let's give people the commit rights right out of the gate.
Oh yeah, let's get all the GraphQL people together for a summit. Like,
yeah, totally.
yeah,
Again,
yeah.
that's another point that I told them they needed to have a conference. You know, I just had the second one that was I wanted to have in San Francisco. I just had Space Camp 2.0. Like that was supposed to be Meteor conference, and they said no, we want to do our own. And I said okay, I'll do like a regional one. I don't think in the long term like they're super committed to Meteor. I think we're going to see Galaxy shift into something else. Like either Apollo is going to spin out to be its own company with a new cap table, or Galaxy is going to spin out to be its own company at some point. Like something's going to change. And I think that Meteor is just going to kind of get like in the split, just drop to the floor, right? Because to me, and I said this all along, like show me a hosting company that's paying for framework development or even language development, right? Like Joyent, I guess, did for a while, but that didn't go good places, right?
Well, Engine Yard with kind of Rails helping out.
But that like they're, I don't know, like Ezra created Merb at Engine Yard, but I like
I share your doubts, and like the rate of the velocity that they accept pull requests. Like, let's we've definitely seen that has been sticky at times. I mean, I think last year I got at least five projects merged. Minor contributions of mine, and then
I still maintain like I've had more contributions accepted to Rails than I have for Meteor.
Hey.
It's not for a lack of effort.
I had the one where Mitar was kind of described a similar thing to what I wanted, and like we both submitted a pull request at the same time, and he actually said, "Oh, you want this one? Like I'll let you have this one." It took 9 months, but I got it in. But and I don't want to belabor like that necessarily, but you're right. Like the community involvement, like it sets a tone for the community. And I do see things going well in Apollo and like community drive. So, I mean, I'm optimistic. And Sashko knows the live data and DDP kind of protocol. I can put myself in his shoes and just imagine, after you kind of like Dan Abramov with React or Redux and React, where he he gets something out there and it gets popular, and then he has all these thoughts in the back of his mind, and now there's got to be a 2.0. It's got to be rebuilt from first principles, and I'm sure that the first principles are going to be really good in Apollo. So hopefully with the right kind of community involvement, it'll be easy to adopt.
And that's what I really like about Dan. I'm like a huge fan of him. He's always communicating nonstop. He's a huge figure just for the sheer fact that, like, not only did he make Redux, but he constantly has blog posts out there. He always keeps people updated. He's hugely involved. He has a few tutorials on egghead.io. He's really taking advantage of all of his resources, and I really do appreciate that from him.
Dan Abramov for president.
Yeah. Well, it could be better than the current pick, but
he's a really wonderful communicator, and in the end, like, I've had a hard time explaining to people sometimes that, like, when I've invested time in Redux and explaining it to people and coding up projects in there, it gets evaluated kind of in the same breath as like any other framework. But what it's forced me to do is write more of my logic in pure JavaScript functions, in functions that can be tested without mocking them, and et cetera, and that are not database dependent. And that has been a godsend. And the whole principle of functional core imperative shell has been pretty unpracticable for me in web applications until now. So, I maintain that, like, good architecture and being able to use pure functions to control each state transition that your app takes is a really nice way to work. And it's actually very similar to a game. I haven't done a whole lot of game development, a little bit in college, and then I like put it down to make CRUD apps. And like, I feel like I'm awakening from a dark, place of CRUD apps where things don't come at you. It's all client initiated, and like the server has no agency. And it's not how a user gets installed into a game. In a game, things come at you. And I think that, like, in the web, things should come at you. And I need to be able to deliver those come at you experiences. So one of the things I've tried to do is invest my energy in things that are not going to easily be deprecated, right? So pure functions won't be deprecated. Another thing that won't be
CS 2019.
And Josh, like I spoke at your first space camp about promises, because I was like, this is a technology that doesn't matter which JavaScript framework you're using, knowing about them is going to be super valuable. And I have a dean's tip for what you should study next, now that everybody's like mastered promises. And you want to know what that is?
What's that?
Observables.
Oh yeah.
It's the one step up. It's the generalization of promises to multiple values. It has a lot in common with Meteor DDP subscriptions, but it's slightly different. And it's the kind of core data type that Meteor wasn't described as a system of observables, but in fact it is.
Right.
And when you can understand that you're looking for a solution, if in my case you need that kind of real timiness, and I know every app doesn't, but then observables is a kind of keyword you'll want to include in your searches, because increasingly it's going to become potentially part of JavaScript language, just like Promise did. And it really embodies this notion of, getting multiple notifications from a server over time, for example, and a whole bunch of other things. So that's my tip.
Yeah. So are you using like RxJS, or what are you?
Yeah, I am, because it's just the completest implementation. It is not the smallest in your bundle, though the new version 5 is better about that. And if you're using Webpack, you can tree shake just the core parts that your app needs. And the combinators that it offers are really, really excellent. It's like if you used Ruby, and the Ruby enumerable methods are just super handy, and so you have that and more coming to you courtesy of RxJS. Also, I don't think that's a bad technological investment, because the principles of RxJS, if you look on the reactivejs.io website, you'll see that Reactivejs is a family of technologies that has been ported to Python, Ruby, .NET. It came from .NET. I learned about it under the moniker of Link when I was a C# developer. And it's been really put forth with a lot of careful planning as far as like the API to be adequate and complete and mathematically airtight. And so it's not a bad investment, because it's a way of thinking that is portable to not only other JavaScript frameworks, but other languages. So hop on that.
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot of things you can look at, right? Like MobX or Redux or RxJS, and it looks like I was even just looking at MobX. They even have like an RX MobX interoperability package that you can install.
Yep.
So, I mean, you're talking about like replacing Tracker and Minimongo to some degree, right?
Yeah, Tracker. I'm done with Tracker. After all of my like 10-minute videos diving into its internals and writing, ways to go from reactive vars to promises or reactive vars to observables. Like I'm just like, reactive var and its ilk. It's been outdone by observables. That's the abstraction you guys were looking for.
Yep. Yeah. Definitely. And I'll say this again. I think, to me, a lot of this boils down to, and this is why I'm maybe leaning towards libraries versus frameworks at this point, is that it's easier for a 4-person team focused on RxJS or observables or MobX or whatever to outpace anything that the Meteor team could have done at its height of people that it had, right? Like, it's definitely down here now, and they used to have a huge staff. And like, David Greenspan, smart guy. Like that guy could sit down, put his mind to task for 2 weeks and like come out with awesome innovation and really push things forward. That was great. But at the same time, like he can only spread around so far, And so I think, to me, some of these things are just better handled by other teams, other people. Like it doesn't make sense to put all your eggs into one basket. And the Meteor community built everything from the ground up, and it happened at a time where I think maybe you had to. I don't know. Like I don't think you could have had something as polished and easy to use as they had when they launched 1.0. If you'd have just done something off the shelf, I don't know. I think it would have been tough.
And see, like that's why I think Meteor was, like you said, so successful at the beginning.
Right.
Coming from a time where people were looking for that one answer that does everything for you, right?
Yeah.
Now it's very modular. You pick, your MobX, you get your React, you get your backend, whatever you want to do. It's very kind of siloed out, which is different than the time it was back then. Everyone was looking for the answer. So I think Meteor, like kind of going back to the longevity of everything, is Meteor took too long to start siloing things out. And I think they're doing a good job with Apollo. Like I said, that's my next thing that I'm going to like learn from start to finish, because I love GraphQL. I've used it several times, and I just like the way that you can get data to the front end. Having to write API controller after API controller to do small different things, save data. I think that GraphQL works excellent for it. But yeah, just kind of going back, I think Meteor was the one size fits all at the beginning. It was good, but they didn't move quickly enough to settle everything out.
Yeah. And I would say this, like I'll give a shout out to Sasha here too, because he is working really, really hard to get a version of Telescope out that is using GraphQL and Apollo and replacing the Meteor piece of it. I think he's still using it as a build tool maybe, but there's no reason to say he couldn't replace it with something like Create React App, and then have Apollo on the back end and just kind of consuming that. And he's done some interesting things. Like he's he's got all this schema already written for how Telescope functions now. So he's actually written, I think he's written it, someone's written it, but it's a simple schema. I think he's just using this simple schema NPM package to consume the simple schema he already has, and then he's generating all the kind of schema for GraphQL off that.
Yeah, that'll go a long way in terms of like helping people who already understand the Telescope app, like kind of convert that idea over. Chris, can I ask you like how you've used GraphQL a couple of times? Do you feel that you get something more from it than could be accomplished with like a couple different Meteor subscriptions, like the paradigm where you'd like subscribe to like a parent collection and then a child collection and just kind of change your subscription parameters? Like, can you help me like the value that you feel GraphQL delivers above that?
Yeah, so I think you essentially could accomplish the exact same thing. Just kind of what kind of felt right was being able, throw a multi-tiered object at your server once it's set up and getting exactly what you want back. So I think that's the difference. That if I need a view, I need a very specific things. You create these relationships and everything, and you have it come back to you exactly like you want it. I think that it feels a lot more natural, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, totally. And I think, the other thing, and this is a thing that maybe you don't care about when you're launching or when you're putting out the first iteration of a product for a client, but it kind of matters too, because if you care about scaling, like there comes a point where Mongo like isn't necessarily the right solution for everything you need in your site, right? And the promise of GraphQL is that you can change out the resolvers on the back end to work with whatever database you need. And so you could move part of your app off into Postgres if that makes sense for you, and you could have other parts in Mongo if you wanted to. So like you start to get this structure and this control over the structure that allows you to easily kind of allow the back-end team to do what they need to do for what makes sense for scaling on their end. And you don't necessarily have to worry about things like versioning or changes on the front end. Like as long as they know the data they want and you figure out how to keep delivering that to them.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting firewall, right? Like between the implementation details of how the data is provided and the one that constructs the query. So that's, generally speaking, a good idea to.
Yeah. Well, I guess at that point, you're talking about like a contract between the front end and the back end, right? And like the data you want is the contract, rather than being like REST API endpoint calls that change or need versioning or anything like that.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like a step in the right direction. I think that like from when you zoom in to a running Meteor app and you go to your Chrome DevTools and your network pane and your WebSocket and your frames and you see those individual messages going back and forth, like those kind of convince me that like those messages themselves, the wire protocol DDP is independent of which database those things are coming from.
It is, but at the same time, like the only practical production implementation of that is still Mongo, right?
Yeah, and there's definitely some quirks with it, like the fact that like you only sync at the level of top level fields. So that can potentially have impact on either your document structure if you cave in that way, or your network performance if you accept that. So I'm sure there's room for more intelligent patching than DDP has. That I'm sure GraphQL, because it lets you custom fit the query that you're making, it can probably convey those diffs in a smarter way. I'm just looking forward to getting to see some tutorials on that that kind of really show me the guts and not just the high level benefit if I'm not using multiple databases or don't have a very deep query tree.
Yeah, I think so. To me, it's still a lot of overhead if you have a small project that's hitting one database and you're not like, if you wouldn't create more than one or two REST endpoints, then it might feel like a lot of overhead to create the schema and the resolvers and like go down that entire path. At the
Yeah.
same time, I think you're talking about like one-time kind of pain points. So,
But yeah, I can think of a client though, like when I was doing that node work that wasn't Meteor, and we were doing, we were doing Swagger endpoints actually.
Oh,
Oh my God,
I'll use
creating
that with
like
C#. Yeah.
a dozen, would I rather create a dozen Swagger endpoints by copying and pasting config file stuff, or would I rather like write a GraphQL resolver? I'd rather write a
Yeah.
GraphQL resolver.
yeah, totally.
And that's, see, the latest job that I was doing, I was working on coding bootcamp software here in Houston. And the amount of API, different API calls we had to make that were just, a lot of them were similar, a lot of, and just having to do that was so repetitive. Like you said, I was copying and pasting constantly. And I would be like, man, if I could just do this one time and then be able to, create relationships and everything, I would go through that pain instead of having to write all these small different CRUD calls. It was ridiculous. Yeah.
So it sounds like, I mean, I'm feeling a consensus here that maybe the data layer makes sense elsewhere. I mean, would you guys agree with that?
Elsewhere outside of what?
Meteor, like not being live query, not being Mongo and like their entire stack.
I mean, I'll just say that there are a lot of options, right? So
Yeah.
there's that option. There's this Redis oplog option that's emerging. That's kind of a bleeding edge thing, but you can try that. There's definitely Apollo, which has a lot of backing and community support. So as far as that, like, are there what's your plan B and C? Like you have them.
Yeah. So I think the other piece is the build tool, right? And like I don't think anyone would argue that Meteor has a great build tool.
Yeah, you know what? Here's one of the investigations that was really a journey for me. So I was fond of Meteor packages.
Mm-hmm.
So I wrote a thing called a package generator, a package boilerplate generator that was like reactive and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, hey, this is how I'm going to deliver my assets. And then, NPM integration was coming along, and I'm like, well, why do that unless if I write an NPM module, it just has to take in a few variables, the dependencies injected, and then I can keep it in NPM and feel less locked into a foreign ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
So then I was looking at NPM generators, and sure enough, Arunoda and Kadira had published an NPM boilerplate generator. And then I was using that for a couple of things, but then I just went back to Yeoman, which I hadn't used for 2 years. But sure enough, they have a really sophisticated, write a ES6 based NPM library with all the bells and whistles of linting and testing, and the tests ran right away, which was refreshing. My Meteor tests are a disaster. They still don't perform as quickly or as predictably as I require a test suite to run. And this NPM, write your own NPM library boilerplate, it's called Generator Babel boilerplate, I believe. The tests run, it uses Webpack to build and run your tests. It uses Mocha. And it just friggin' works. You open up testrunner.html, and you don't even have to run a server other than Webpack to continually lint and test your code. And that experience as a library developer, like you ask me, do I want to invest my time putting my stuff in Atmosphere or on NPM? Well, that's a clear answer. Even if I'm going to continue to use Meteor, I want to invest my time writing libraries for NPM. And the solutions. It's just a story of my moving farther and farther from what the Meteor core team offers to looking to then Arunoda, and then looking to the general JavaScript community. And who's the winner? Well, it's the largest pool, right, Josh?
It is. I'm very much of that opinion, right? Because if you look, like still to this day, I think there's more articles, more thought share, more books about RSpec versus any other testing framework in the Rails community. And I think that they ultimately had slightly better tooling, but only because they were out there like grabbing that mind share and getting people to contribute. And welcoming that contribution in a way that the community move forward with hopefully better code, right? And so I'm definitely of that mindset. And I gave a very similar talk to what you're saying when I was in New York at Meteor Camp NYC, which was, now's the time. Embrace Node, embrace NPM ecosystem. Like, get your dependencies from there. Use React Router. Don't use Flow Router, right? Because I had the conversation there and with Aaron Noda privately, and he said, "Yeah, I don't think we're going to update Flow Router anymore."
Yeah, and Chris mentioned the mantra solution, also looking a little old and left. I could call it abandonware, but it's really just like left to the community to decide if anybody wants to maintain it.
Right, and I appreciate that he came out and said, like, "Hey, someone take over this," but at the same time, like, I think the practicality of that, when you let a community kind of wither on the vine, is less and less likely for someone to step up and kind of become that into that leader role.
Yeah.
I think that there were a number of people that would have been super interested in regards to Meteor and helping out and taking over in a leadership role probably a year ago, even 2 years ago. And they could have involved the community a lot more now. And that's where I feel a lot of that ivory tower stuff comes in. And to me, like, I don't know, it's hard because you want to see Meteor kind of like hug all the latest and greatest things, like, yes, we're a big happy community. But at the same time, like, you do have this established community of people that have an application and they don't necessarily want to see breaking changes come out. And, this kind of goes back to 1.3 as well. Like that should have been Meteor 2.0 in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was such a huge departure from how we made applications like before and after. And it was big.
I just had a guilty pleasure week where I wrote a bunch of code in lib, like the old days. I used imports between them, which was nice. I was so overwhelmed by trying to keep up with fast forwarding my logic from the first Meteor app I made in 0.9, that chessboard thing that I've presented on. And then getting that thing up to 1.4.2, I had so many decisions to make along the way. And then I said, hey, I wonder if lib still works. And it
totally.
does.
For now. And we'll see, like, if like lib should break if we get things like tree shaking and code splitting and that kind of thing. And it should break, right? Like, I think it's probably the wrong decision to autoload everything. I think the imports folder was a terrible punt, but it was a punt because you have all these, at this point, you call them legacy applications, right? And that's the same reason we don't have Webpack in Meteor today as a quick build tool, is because, like, you got to support all these applications over here. And even though there's new ones over here that want to be built, like, I think you start to get into this, like, it's really hard for you to innovate and move forward as you have a lot of code. Like, it takes a lot of effort. And at this point, we've reduced the team to one. And therefore, I'm much more interested in things like create React app, or, and that is a hard thing to say fast.
Create React.
Yeah. Or
if you say it really
Next.js.
fast, it sounds like crap.
React.
But so don't drop any of those letters. Oh, Next.js. Explain a little bit about that, and Feathers too, if you've heard about that, Josh.
Yeah. So Feathers is probably closer to Meteor as it stands right now, in the fact that they have a bunch of integration points in the back end, and then you can create services they're just basically pushing the data out, and then they have a library similar to Minimongo and Tracker on the front end that's reactive, and so then you can use something like React or Angular on the front end. So you're really just getting like that bridge in that back end. So they're just kind of providing harnesses, but they've got a lot of them, right? And so that's kind of interesting. I've actually been working on the next CreatorConf, and Eric Krisky from Feathers is going to give a talk on building an API in 30 minutes.
Yeah.
A good API in 30 minutes.
Meaning real time and REST?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, I mean that's where I think things should go. REST should be an edge case of real time, where you're just not interested.
Yeah, with Feathers though, I did a video over Feathers actually about back in March. I don't know if you ever saw it, but the fact that you can get APIs up and running that fast with Feathers is awesome, and you still have the real time with it. So
yeah, I totally agree. And it's very, very intriguing to me. I still think like it's one of the interview with the Feathers team is one of the biggest traffic generators on my YouTube channel, which, I mean, if you think about it, I have how many Meteor videos, and like that one still drives in more traffic than some of the Meteor videos. And so I think that's maybe another piece I've used to gauge this. Like I decided October of last year to move away from Meteor, slowly but surely positioning things, and that's why Creator's tagline started to change, and like I've been slowly converting from Meteor.js Club to Space Dojo and those kinds of things, because I knew like the longevity of Meteor, like I could see it start to trend off in Google, so yeah, I've definitely been thinking about this a lot. Or I did think about it a lot, but the other one that I mentioned, Next.js, is kind of interesting. It's probably more along the lines of create React app, in the fact that it's more of the front end. When you install it, it comes with its own router, which has been interesting, and it's generating. It's universal, so in that aspect, it's a little bit closer to Meteor, and you just have to make sure that your what's the call now? There's a call that you start when your React app is mounting up and you want to
eject
initial props.
initial.
So as long as you put your data fetching and get initial props, it will run your get initial props on the server and then build your component and then send it down as HTML for the page in question. So it's doing SSR by default, and as long as everything's packaged into that get initial props, then it'll run right there and deliver the data with it. The other upside is with using it, it can detect when links are on the page, and it will use a service worker and go pre-fetch the data for the links on the page, so that it's ready to go. When you click that link, it should be like that,
Nice.
That's a big. Sorry, my daughter's taking the dog next door. So yeah, I think that's a big piece of it that gets interesting as well. I think the thing that is maybe weird at this point is like you do have to map your routes to like actual pages underneath. So like if I want a page, I need to create it in the pages folder, and that's how the router works. So I don't know that you could. I haven't tried it yet, but I don't know if you can have dynamic routes necessarily right now. But that is something that's on their list to work on, and I think that's a big piece that, like, once it's done, it'll be a big thing, and like it'll make Next.js way more useful in my mind.
So yeah, I'm just now hearing about Next.js. So is this gaining a lot of traction? Do you see? You kind of see.
I see other people talking about it. Like I spent a day and imported CreatorConf from. It was just static HTML, and I was using Jekyll and GitHub Pages to host that thing. And the problem I had, like, and this is maybe going to be the laziest thing I say, but I hate editing HTML. Like, it's not my favorite thing, especially just like straight HTML. And when it's like repetitive, like that's annoying to me. And maybe that's the most programmery thing I can say. But so I ended up spending time like porting it to Next so that I could just create a JavaScript object that I would hand to the page. And like anytime I want to create a new conference, I just fill out this JavaScript object with the relevant info and, create a new page and tell it to import that object and I'm done. Like it just works and it's server-side rendered and all that kind of stuff. So it's nice. And I think that it's unopinionated on what the back end is, right? Like you could bring in observables and I think RxJS works easily with Falcor, right? So you could use something like Falcor on the back end if that made sense. You could use Apollo. I think Sashko's had a conversation with the Next team maybe. But I'm very, very interested in that. So that's where my head's at right now. Like I'm looking at GraphQL and Next.js and kind of paying attention to the issue trackers. And if they can tweak the router to work the way that I need it to work, then I'm going to be super excited about using it for a lot more things. And it comes with Webpack under the covers, so I don't even have to worry about messing with Webpack. It just kind of works.
Yeah. I think the build tool stuff that you can get with Webpack, like when I was writing that standalone NPM module, I didn't even think about my test suite or the fact that the testing and stuff was written in Gulp. I've never written Gulp before, but again, I was just the library author, like writing tests and watching them pass reactively in hundredths of a second, which is nice, versus like, the rebuild times and stuff. So there's just a lot of things have moved on definitely since like the 1.0 days, where that fight for mindshare is an interesting one.
Yeah.
It's been a good hour already, huh?
Yeah. I think we should definitely call it here.
All right.
I don't want to go beyond that, but this has been an interesting talk. I think, my I guess advice to people is probably along the lines of Abi's post, which is find ways to minimize your reliance on Meteor itself and try to embrace the ecosystem at large, and just slowly replace the things that you can where you can. If you have an existing app, right? And like that's the biggest question that I get a lot is just, should I move off Meteor? Well, that's more of a business question than it is a technology question, in my opinion. Like if your business is running and profitable and not suffering problems because of Meteor, like absolutely you should not move off of Meteor right now, because it's not broken. It's not impossible to make changes to it. It's not like, I think it all still works the same way it did. You can roll back to 1.0 if that made you happy, or go back to 1.2. And like those are totally options that work fine. And if it's functioning, then great. But I think at some point you'll hit problems, and I think there's going to be less and less people around to help you with those problems. So.
And yeah, adding on to that, I think again, a lot of people get caught up in the technology, like you just said. There's a time and place for Meteor. For instance, I'm having a friend come over this weekend, and we're going to be working on an app, and we're probably going to be using Meteor just because, again, it's fast. It's like an easy way to go. But hey, if I'm going to write banking software, I'm probably not going to use Meteor for that. If I'm going to write, some really security, needed application that like I just said, banking software, I'm not going to use Meteor for that. But hey, for a prototype, for something that needs to be done quickly and fast and needs that response, that real-time functionality, I'm definitely going to use Meteor. So definitely look at what problem you have and pick the best technology for it.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And just to say, my final advice is that the three areas to invest some research in: the distributed logs, systems that communicate by sharing a distributed log, append-only systems. I'll have some links on that. Looking at putting more of your code in pure JavaScript functions for the win, and observables for the win.
Yeah. All right, awesome. Well, thanks guys for coming on and taking the time to chat. You know what I think I'm going to do is actually put this out twice. We'll put this out as a Space Dojo show as well. So it'll go to both feeds, so everybody gets to listen to it.
Yep.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, Josh.
Yeah. All right, guys. Tune in. I think maybe we'll have one more show. I got to talk to Ben Dogood and see if he's available next week maybe. But tune in next time, guys, and we'll have another news-filled show next time. This video has been a Space Dojo production. You can click the Learn More button to find out more about us at spacedojo.com. Or you can click the subscribe button to get notified about new videos we put out each week. Thanks for watching.